What happens when a simple flight turns into a public spectacle for Barron Trump? A routine trip spiraled into chaos, but no one expected the storm that followed when Melania arrived. The loudspeaker crackled as a final boarding call echoed through the bustling terminal of Dallas Love Field Airport. Barron Trump sat near gate C-12, his tall frame folded into a chair that seemed too small for his stature. He kept his head down, scrolling through his phone, trying to blend into the crowd of travelers rushing to make their flights. At 17, his life was anything but ordinary, yet he had mastered the art of staying under the radar in public. But today, that effort was about to be tested. A gate agent, an older man with sharp features and an air of impatience, approached the area. His eyes landed on Barron, who was in the priority boarding section. Something about the teenager's aloof demeanor seemed to rub him the wrong way. The agent's voice cut through the ambient noise. "Excuse me, young man," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Barron looked up, startled but calm. "Yes, I am. I have a first-class ticket." His voice was steady but polite, his upbringing shining through. The agent scrutinized him for a moment, his gaze flickering to Barron's phone, his casual hoodie, and sneakers. "Can I see your ticket?" Barron hesitated. It wasn't the first time he'd been singled out for no apparent reason, but something about this man's tone felt different, more aggressive. He handed over his boarding pass, his name clearly displayed on the screen. "Barron Trump," the agent read aloud. Pausing, his expression shifted, but instead of backing off, his demeanor hardened. "Wait here." Passengers around them began to take notice. Their whispers were a low hum of curiosity. Barron felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his expression neutral. Moments later, the agent returned, flanked by a supervisor. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket," the agent said firmly. "You'll need to step aside while we sort this out." Barron frowned. "What issue? I booked this ticket weeks ago." The supervisor cut in. "We're handling it, sir. Please step away from the gate." As Barron reluctantly moved aside, he could feel the stares of fellow passengers. Some pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. The murmurs grew louder. His frustration simmered, but he bit his tongue, unwilling to make a scene. But the situation wasn't about to de-escalate. It was just getting started. Barron leaned against a nearby column, watching the other passengers board without issue. The glances from the gate staff and murmurs from the crowd felt heavier with each passing second. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure of what was taking so long. Was this about his last name, or something else entirely? He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this was starting to feel personal. After several minutes, the supervisor returned, his expression still stern. "We're unable to verify your identity through the system. Do you have another form of identification?" Barron furrowed his brow. "My passport is in my carry-on bag. You didn't even check it." The supervisor hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the logical response, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Sir, this isn't just about ID. There are procedures we need to follow." "Procedures?" Barron asked, his tone calm but tinged with disbelief. "What procedures?" "I've flown through this airport dozens of times without an issue." The gate agent from earlier interjected. "We've had some irregularities lately. You're not being singled out." But the look in his eyes betrayed him. Barron wasn't buying it, and neither were a few passengers nearby who began muttering among themselves. A woman in her late 40s, holding a toddler on her hip, spoke up. "What's the problem? He's just a kid with a ticket. Let him board." The supervisor ignored her, focusing instead on Barron. "You'll need to wait here while we conduct a further review. If you don't comply, we'll have to escalate the matter." "Escalate?" Barron echoed, his patience wearing thin. "What exactly are you escalating? I've done nothing wrong." As if on cue, a pair of airport security officers appeared. Barron's chest tightened, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief at how quickly the situation was spiraling. The officers stood on either side of him, their presence drawing even more attention. Phones were out now, recording every second. "Sir, please come with us," one officer said in a measured tone. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Barron exhaled, his jaw tightening as he grabbed his carry-on bag. "Fine," he muttered, following them into a small sterile room near the gate. The whispers and camera flashes followed him like a storm cloud. Inside, the officers asked him to sit at a table. The air felt colder, heavier, as one officer began flipping through his passport. "This is ridiculous," Barron muttered under his breath, shaking his head. One of the officers looked up. "We're just following protocol, son." But that word, protocol, was starting to sound like an excuse for something more sinister, and the more they probed, the more Barron began to feel the weight of an unspoken bias in the room. But what Barron didn't know was that someone else was already on her way, and she wasn't happy. In the back seat of a black SUV weaving through Dallas traffic, Melania Trump sat poised, her phone in hand. She had planned a quick trip to surprise her son at the airport after his flight. But as her phone buzzed with a flood of text messages and social media alerts, her expression shifted from calm to concern. One message caught her attention. "Something's going on with Barron at the airport. People are posting videos." Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up a short clip that showed Barron surrounded by security, being led away from the gate. She replayed it twice, her brow furrowing deeper with each pass. "Driver, please hurry," she said, her voice cool but firm. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Barron sat in the small room, staring at the blank wall in front of him. The officers had stepped out to verify his credentials, leaving him alone to stew in silence. He didn't know who to call or what to do. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping lightly, a rhythm he didn't even realize he was making. Suddenly, the door opened, and the supervisor from earlier walked in. "We're still working on clearing up the situation," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It shouldn't be much longer." "How much longer?" Barron asked, his tone sharp. "You've had all my information for almost an hour." The supervisor hesitated, then mumbled something about procedures again before retreating. Barron exhaled in frustration, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just about a ticket or ID anymore. It felt like something deeper. Outside the terminal, Melania's SUV pulled up to the curb. She stepped out, her posture commanding despite her understated outfit. Heads turned as she strode through the airport, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't need to announce her presence. People simply moved aside as she passed. Approaching the gate where the incident had occurred, she was met with a flurry of murmurs and whispers. Passengers recognized her instantly, and some even pointed toward the area where security had taken Barron. "Excuse me," she said to a nearby airline employee. "Where is my son?" The employee blinked, stunned by the directness of her question. "Ma'am, let me check." Melania didn't wait for a response. She moved forward, her eyes scanning for any sign of Barron. When she spotted the room where he was being held, her pace quickened. She reached the door just as the two officers returned to Barron. They froze when they saw her, their expressions a mix of surprise and apprehension. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that demanded an answer. "Mrs. Trump," one officer began, fumbling for words, "this is just a standard protocol." "Protocol?" she interrupted, her gaze icy. "You are holding my son in a small room with no explanation. What kind of protocol is this?" The supervisor appeared behind her, his face pale. "Mrs. Trump, this is all just a misunderstanding. We were trying to verify his ticket." "A misunderstanding?" Her voice remained steady, but her tone sharpened. "Do you treat all passengers this way, or just the ones you decide don't belong in first class today?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt like time itself had stopped. But this silence wouldn't last for long. Melania was about to demand answers they couldn't provide. Her gaze didn't waver as she stood in the doorway. Barron glanced at his mother, his relief visible but restrained. He straightened in his chair, his shoulders no longer slumped. "Mrs. Trump," the supervisor stammered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Please understand, we were just trying to ensure everything was in order." "This isn't in order," Melania interrupted, her tone as sharp as the silence in the room. "You had his ticket, his passport, and his name. What else do you need? A written invitation to board the plane?" The supervisor flinched but tried to recover. "We, flagged his name in the system, and that required additional checks." Melania tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Flagged because he's my son, or because someone decided he didn't belong in first class today?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, neither wanting to be the one to respond. The tension was palpable, and everyone in the room felt it. Finally, one of the officers cleared his throat. "It's standard procedure, ma'am." We weren't aware of his relation to you until just now. Melania's eyes narrowed. So this is about his last name? The supervisor opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand to stop him. Save your excuses. I want to speak to someone in charge now. The man hesitated but eventually nodded, stepping out of the room to make a call. Melania turned her attention to Barron, her expression softening as she approached him. Are you okay? She asked quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Barron nodded, his voice steady but weary. I'm fine, Mom. Just a little shaken up. Melania kissed the top of his head, her hand lingering for a moment. We're leaving, now. As they walked out of the room, the supervisor appeared at the door, looking as though he'd been caught in a flood. Mrs. Trump, we apologize for the misunderstanding. Please accept our sincerest apologies. But Melania didn't respond. She kept walking, her heels clicking with purpose, as Barron walked beside her, his head held high. The incident was over, but the message was clear. No one, no matter their name or status, should ever have to endure something like this again.